Barton Vale didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed through the door of Harlan's cookhouse like he owned the building, which, as of last Thursday, he did, and the room went the way rooms always went when Barton Vale entered them. Quiet. The kind of quiet that comes not from respect, but from the particular fear of men who have watched someone lose everything at the word of one person and cannot afford to be next. He stood in the doorway, let his eyes drag across every table until they landed on the corner booth, and then he smiled. "Well," he said, loud enough for the room to hear, loud enough that no one could pretend they hadn't. "If it isn't Abilene's most famous beggar, if you had been in that cookhouse on the 4th day of July, 1874, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if a story like this is the kind that keeps you up at night, that makes you think about your own life, your own choices, your own people, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that bell so you never miss a single story. And when you're done watching, drop a comment below and tell me what city, or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to that cookhouse. The summer of 1874 had not been kind to western Kansas. The heat came early and stayed late, the kind that cracked the ground open and turned the air above the roads into something you could almost see moving. Abilene was a town that had known prosperity the cattle trade had made. Men rich almost overnight, but that prosperity had a short memory, and by midsummer it had already begun forgetting the people who'd built it with their hands. Vivian Mercer arrived at Harlan's cookhouse at noon, which was later than she intended. She had spent the morning at the bank, going over numbers that no longer needed going over, because going over numbers was something to do, and doing something was better than sitting in the house her husband had left her and feeling the size of every room. Harold Mercer had been dead for 2 years. The house was still his. She suspected it would always feel that way. She wore a gray dress, which was her version of inconspicuous. The gray dress, instead of the blue one, instead of the green. The gray dress meant she was not trying to be noticed. Whether it worked depended on who was in the room, and in Abilene, it almost never worked, because Vivian Mercer was the wealthiest widow in 3 counties, and people had a habit of tracking money the way dogs track meat. She chose a table near the window, which was a mistake, because it put her in full view of the room. But she hadn't chosen it for the view. She'd chosen it because from there she could see the corner booth, where a man and a small boy were sitting together over what appeared to be a single bowl of food. She didn't mean to watch them. She watched them anyway. The man was somewhere in his mid-30s, though hard work had written its own additional years across his face and hands. He was lean in the way that men who don't eat enough are lean, not the lean of health, but the lean of subtraction, of giving more than you take in for long enough that the body starts to edit itself. His hands were the hands of a man who worked iron. She could see the discoloration even from across the room, the permanent dark that no amount of scrubbing removes, the knuckles that had been split so many times they'd stopped bothering to heal smooth. Craftsman, a blacksmith maybe, or close to it. There was a scar along his jaw that she couldn't stop looking at, pale against the weathered skin, shaped like a question mark if you tilted your head. The boy was 7, maybe 8. He had his father's coloring and his father's particular way of holding himself not proud, exactly, but self-possessed. Sitting up straight the way children sit, when they've been told more than once that sitting up matters. He had a book open on the table beside the bowl, though he wasn't reading it at the moment. He was watching his father, and his father was pushing the bowl toward him. Not offering, pushing. The way you push something, when you want to make clear there is no negotiation happening, when you want to foreclose the possibility of argument before it starts. The bowl went from the center of the table to directly in front of the boy, and the man settled back with his coffee, just coffee, nothing else, and said something that Vivian couldn't hear from across the room. The boy said something back. The man shook his head. The boy picked up the spoon. He ate 3 bites, then stopped and looked at his father again. The man said something else, something that was clearly meant to sound casual, and clearly wasn't, and made a gesture that meant eat, just eat. I'm fine. And Vivian had to look away, because she felt she was seeing something that was not meant to be witnessed. She had eaten that morning. She had eaten a full breakfast, prepared by the woman she paid, to come in 3 mornings a week. Eggs and bread and a cut of ham. She had left half of it on her plate because she wasn't hungry. She sat with that thought for a moment and found it uncomfortable in a way she hadn't expected. She was still sitting with it when she made a decision that she would later understand had changed the entire direction of her life. Though in the moment it felt like nothing more than a small impulsive act, the kind she usually talked herself out of. She stood up. She crossed the room. She stopped at the edge of the corner booth and said, "Excuse me, would you mind terribly if I joined you?" The man looked up at her. He didn't look suspicious, which she expected. He didn't look flattered, which she also expected. He looked for a brief moment like a man trying to figure out if he'd done something wrong without realizing it. Then that passed, and his face settled into something more straightforward. "It's a free country," he said, which was not precisely a warm welcome, but it wasn't a refusal either. She sat down across from them. "I'm Vivian," she said. She left off the last name deliberately. "Caleb," the man said. He nodded toward the boy. "That's Evan." Evan looked at her with the frank, unguarded curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned that looking at strangers too directly was considered impolite. "Do you live here?" he asked. "In Abilene, yes. We don't," Evan said. "We live about 4 miles out, by the creek," Caleb said quietly. "What?" she asked. She didn't ask, she would have. Caleb looked at Vivian with an expression that was trying very hard not to be apologetic. She got the impression he'd spent a fair amount of time having conversations that went this way. "He's right," she said. "I would have." The smallest shift happened in Caleb's face. Not a smile, she wouldn't get a smile for a while yet, but something that acknowledged she'd said something unexpected. They sat together in the particular awkwardness of people who have introduced themselves without yet knowing why, while Evan worked through the bowl of stew with the focused attention of a child who is genuinely hungry, and Vivian ordered herself coffee and nothing else, because ordering food felt wrong in a way she couldn't entirely articulate. "What do you do?" she asked Caleb. "Forge work. Repair mostly. Wagon parts, tools, hinges, whatever comes in. Is there much call for it?" "Some weeks." She understood what that meant. "Some weeks." "Not all weeks, not enough weeks. And you live out by the creek," she said. 4 miles, Evan confirmed, without looking up from his book, which he had opened again, now that the bowl was mostly empty. "What are you reading?" Evan held up the book. The cover was worn enough that she had to squint. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. It had been published only a couple of years ago. She wondered where he'd gotten it. "My mother's," Evan said, which answered that. She liked stories. The past tense arrived in the sentence with a weight that he'd clearly already learned to carry, because his voice didn't change when he said it. That was the thing that got her. Not the fact itself, but the practiced ease of it. Caleb was looking out the window. Vivian looked at her coffee and found she had nothing useful to say, which was unusual. She was generally good at conversation. She was good at the social machinery of Abilene, the dinners, the committees, the careful navigation of who was allied with whom. She had maintained every connection Harold had built and added several of her own, which everyone agreed was impressive, and some people found faintly threatening. She was not, in other words, a woman who ran out of words. But she sat in that corner booth and ran out of words. What she had instead was the distinct and uncomfortable feeling that she was more at ease in this conversation, such as it was, than she'd been at any dinner table in 2 years. That was the moment Barton Vale walked in. She heard his voice before she fully registered who it was. That was always how it was with Barton Vale. He was a man whose presence led with his voice, loud and deliberate, shaped by years of practice at making rooms rearrange themselves around him. Turned. He had seen them already, of course he had. Barton Vale's eyes moved across rooms the way a hawk's eyes moved across fields, scanning for anything that could be used. And what he saw in that corner booth, the town's wealthiest widow sitting across from a man whose clothes were worn at every stress point, whose boots had been resoled at least twice, whose coffee was the cheapest thing on the menu, clearly delighted him in the particular way that other people's discomfort delighted him. He crossed the room without being invited. That was his signature move. Barton Vale didn't wait to be invited anywhere. He arrived, and that was considered invitation enough. "Vivian," he said pleasantly, stopping at the end of the booth. "I didn't expect to find you here. People eat lunch, Barton." "They do." He let his eyes move to Caleb with the studied casualness of someone performing casualness rather than feeling it. "And who's your friend?" Caleb looked at him without speaking. There was a particular kind of stillness that Vivian would come to associate with Caleb Rourke over the following months. Not passive, not aggressive, but the stillness of a man who has learned that reacting quickly costs more than it returns. He sat with Barton Vale's gaze on him the way iron sits in a fire, not moving, just absorbing. "This is Caleb," Vivian said, "and his son, Evan." "Caleb," Barton repeated, with the faint emphasis of a man tasting something disappointing. His eyes went to the empty bowl, to the coffee, to the worn cuffs of Caleb's jacket. He assembled the picture with visible pleasure. "Caleb, what is it you do?" "Forge work," Caleb said. "Forge work." Barton nodded slowly, the way people nod when they already know the answer, and just wanted to hear you say it. That's honest work. For honest people. He said honest the way some men say simple, with a smile wrapped around it that had nothing to do with warmth. "I suppose it pays enough to keep body and soul together." Just about. The room had gotten quiet again. That specific Barton Vale quiet. Evan had stopped reading. Caleb still hadn't moved. Barton turned back to Vivian with the air of a man sharing a private joke. "You know, I worry about you, Vivian. Harold would have wanted someone keeping an eye out. Making sure you were keeping company with the right sort." He glanced at Caleb one more time just briefly. Just enough. You can always tell a man by where he takes his meals. It was the smile that did it. That specific, precise, self-satisfied smile. The one that said he believed himself entirely safe. Because he believed she would do what she always did in rooms like this. Smile back, deflect, let it pass, preserve the peace. Vivian set down her coffee cup. "Barton," she said, in a voice she did not raise even a fraction of an inch. "I need you to hear what I'm about to say very carefully." He blinked, just slightly. "I know exactly what you paid Dawson for that printing contract. I know who you paid, and I know what they gave you in return. And I know that Commissioner Hale would find the details of that arrangement extremely relevant to approximately 4 separate questions he's been trying to answer for the last 8 months. She paused. "I also know that you've been telling people that the land title on the Mercer North parcel is in dispute, which is interesting, because I reviewed that deed not 3 weeks ago, and there isn't a dispute. There's a rumor, one that started somewhere." She looked at him steadily. "Now, you are going to walk away from this table. You are going to do that without saying another word to this man or his son. And then we're not going to need to have a longer conversation about the things I know." Silence in the room had changed quality. It had gone from the watchful silence of people. It had gone from the watchful silence of trying not to attract attention to the held breath silence of people watching something they'll be talking about for weeks. Barton Vale's smile was gone. In its place was the face that's underneath the smile, which was considerably less pleasant. "Vivian, goodbye, Barton." He left. He did it slowly to save some face, but he left. The noise of the room came back gradually. Conversation resuming, in the careful way of people pretending they hadn't heard every word. Vivian picked up her coffee cup again. Her hand, she noted privately, was not entirely steady. She was better at making threats than she was at the aftermath of making them. Across the table, Caleb was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know. It'll cost you something. Men like that, they collect debts. I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. Evan was watching them both with the alert, careful attention of a child who understands more of adult conversations than adults generally account for. "He was right about one thing," Caleb said finally. "You can tell something about a man by where he takes his meals, and by who he takes them with." He looked at her. "Why did you come over here? Really?" She thought about the honest answer, which was that she had watched him push his bowl across to his son, and felt something that she didn't have a clean word for, not pity, not admiration. Something between and underneath both of those things, something that had to do with the recognition of a value she couldn't buy, and therefore couldn't be certain she possessed. "I was tired of eating alone," she said instead, which was also true, and less complicated. Evan accepted this without comment and went back to his book. Caleb looked at her for a moment longer, then nodded once. Not warm, not cold, just acknowledging. "Well," he said, "the coffee here is worse than it should be for what they charge." "Terrible," Vivian agreed. "Evan keeps suggesting we try the place on 2nd Street. "I like it there," Evan said, without looking up. "They have pie." "We don't need pie." "You might need pie. You don't know." Caleb looked at the ceiling briefly. Vivian looked at the table to avoid smiling too visibly, because it felt important in this first hour not to seem like she was laughing at him. But the thing that stayed with her, after Caleb paid his bill and gathered Evan and his book and said a quiet, careful goodbye, the thing that followed her home, And into the long, quiet evening of her house was not the confrontation with Barton Vale, and not the surprising ease of the conversation, and not even the image of the bowl being pushed across the table. It was the receipt she found when she returned home and went through the old box she'd been meaning to sort for 2 years. The box that held her father's papers, the letters, the ledgers, the remnants of a life that had nearly come apart at the seams when she was 19 and had only been held together by one anonymous transaction, a payment for a failing property at twice its worth, from a buyer who left no name. The receipt was old. The ink had gone brown at the edges. The handwriting was plain and functional, without flourish. At the bottom, where a signature should have been, were 2 initials, CR. She sat with the receipt in her hands for a long time. Outside, the Kansas dark came down. Inside, everything she thought she understood about the afternoon rearranged itself into a shape she hadn't seen coming. She didn't sleep that night. She tried. She lay in the bed that was too large for one person and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around her the way old houses do, ticking and groaning in the dark like something alive and restless. The receipt was on the nightstand. She'd set it there because putting it away felt like pretending she hadn't found it, and she was done pretending things for the evening. CR 2 letters, brown ink on paper that had gone soft at the folds. Her father had kept it in the bottom of his lockbox. Underneath the deed to the Wichita property, underneath the deed to the Wichita Ante, a letter from her mother that Vivian had never read because it was not addressed to her, and some privacy should survive death. She'd found the lockbox 2 years ago when Harold died, and she was settling accounts and realized she needed to understand the full shape of what she had. Her father had been gone for 11 years by then. The lockbox had sat in the corner of Harold's study the entire time they were married, and she had never opened it because her father had asked her not to, and she had respected that. And then she forgot about it, the way you forget about locked things when you are busy living. She had opened it after Harold died because she needed to know what she had. That was how grief worked sometimes. It turned practical on you before you were ready. She'd seen the receipt then, had noted the initials, had felt a brief and formless curiosity, had set it aside. There were more pressing papers to deal with, an estate to settle, a life to reorganize from the inside out. She had not thought about it again until tonight, until she came home from Harlan's cookhouse with Caleb Rourke's name sitting in her head. She lay in the dark and assembled what she knew, which was not much. The receipt was dated 1861. She had been 19. Her father's dry goods business had caught fire in March of that year, not arson, just bad luck and a faulty lamp. The way most disasters are more ordinary than they have any right to be, and the fire had taken the warehouse and most of the inventory, and left them with a debt that her father could not see a way around. He had been trying to sell the property, the building lot, and the attached residence, and the offers coming in were exactly what you'd expect. When buyers knew a man was desperate, low and insultingly so, and then one offer had come in at twice the asking price. Anonymous, through an intermediary. Her father had taken it without asking too many questions, because when a drowning man finds a board, he doesn't stop to wonder where it came from. That money had saved them, paid the debt, bought time, given her father enough stability to rebuild over the following 3 years, slowly and imperfectly, and the business he rebuilt had eventually given Vivian enough of a foundation that when Harold Mercer came along and offered her a different kind of future, she had been able to choose it without desperation. She owed a great deal to that anonymous payment. And now she was lying in the dark, thinking about a man she'd shared a table with for 40 minutes. A man whose initials were the same 2 letters, sitting on her nightstand. A man who had pushed his bowl of stew to his son, and ordered only coffee, and said some weeks when she asked if there was much call for his work. She told herself it was a coincidence, the initials C. R covered a fair portion of the population. She told herself she was building a story out of very little, which was a habit she had, filling in blank spaces with narrative because blank spaces made her anxious. She told herself that for about an hour. Then she got up and started thinking about how to find him. It took her 3 days. She didn't ask around directly, because asking around directly in Abilene was the same as publishing an announcement in the weekly paper. She was still managing the fallout from the cookhouse. Word had gotten out about what she'd said to Barton Vale. Of course it had, because it always did. Because Abilene was a town that ran on other people's business. And the reactions had been predictable and split almost exactly down the line of who owed Barton Vale a favor and who didn't. Two women she'd sat on the church auxiliary with had canceled plans to call. Margaret Hollis, who genuinely disliked Barton Vale, for reasons she'd never fully explained, had sent a note that said "only good for you" in her cramped handwriting, which Vivian had appreciated more than she expected. So she asked carefully. She mentioned to her banker that she was thinking of having some ironwork done, and asked if he knew of any reliable craftsmen in the county. He gave her 4 names. One of them was Caleb Rourke, out near Dry Creek, which was about 4 miles northeast. She took her time about going. She told herself she was being sensible, thinking it through, making sure she wasn't acting on impulse. That was not entirely a lie. She was also, if she was honest, a little afraid of what she might find out, because there were only 2 possibilities. Either the initials were coincidence, and she would have to sit with the knowledge that she'd spent 3 days tracking down a man she'd had coffee with on the strength of 2 letters, which was embarrassing. Or they weren't coincidence, and the bowl of stew made sense in a way that would require her to rethink everything she thought. She understood about how the world arranged itself. Neither option was entirely comfortable. She went on the 4th day, in the morning, before she could talk herself out of it again. The road out to Dry Creek was rutted and uneven, the road that reminded you with every yard that comfort was a thing you paid for, and most people couldn't. She drove herself, which raised eyebrows at the livery when she turned down the offer of a driver, but she had made a habit of doing things that raised eyebrows in small ways so that people eventually stopped expecting her to need permission for everything. She heard the forge before she saw it. The sound of it came through the dry air, a rhythmic hammering, steady and deliberate, the kind of sound that has a patience to it, because you cannot rush iron. You can only work it when it's ready. She followed the sound past a stand of cottonwoods, down a shallow slope toward where the creek cut a pale line through the brown earth, and there it was. A forge shed, open on one side, with a stack of finished work leaning against the outer wall. A small house behind it, simple and functional. A wagon axle propped against a fence post, waiting for repair. Caleb Rourke was at the anvil with his back to her, and he was working something he couldn't identify from the distance. His whole body in it the way it has to be when you're working iron, because iron doesn't respond to half measures. He hadn't heard her approach over the sound of his own work. There was a wooden crate turned upside down near the open side of the shed with a book on it and a cup that had gone cold, which told her Evan had been there recently and had stepped away somewhere. She looked around and didn't see him. She got down from the wagon and stood there for a moment, holding the receipt in her hand, feeling abruptly and completely ridiculous. Then Caleb turned around. He saw her. His expression went through several things, quickly surprise, then caution, then something she couldn't name, and he set the hammer down on the anvil and straightened up. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, which told her that he'd found out her name since the cookhouse. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. "I told you to call me Vivian. That was before I knew who you were. I'm the same person." He looked at her without answering that, which was, she supposed, fair. She walked toward him. She was aware of how she looked against this backdrop, the gray dress that was her version of inconspicuous, the way she moved, the things about her that announced money regardless of what she tried to wear. She watched him notice all of it and reassemble his impression of her and keep his face mostly neutral while he did it. "I need to show you something," she said. She held out the receipt. He didn't take it right away. He looked at her face first, trying to read what this was, and she couldn't blame him for that caution. Then he took it. She watched him look at it. She watched his face. He didn't perform anything. That was the thing she noticed first. There was no pretense of not recognizing it, no manufactured confusion, no careful blankness. His expression did something she hadn't expected, which was that it went soft. Not emotional, exactly, she got the impression. He kept a considerable distance between himself and the public expression of emotion, but something underneath his usual steadiness shifted, like a door opening just slightly in a very solid wall. He was quiet for a long moment. "Where did you get this?" he said. "My father kept it. I found it after he died." "Your father was Edmund Crawley." "Edmund Crawley was my maiden name, yes." He turned the receipt over in his hands, and she had the strong impression he was looking at it, not because he needed to see it. He clearly already knew exactly what it was, but because he needed somewhere to look that wasn't her face. "How long have you been carrying this around?" he asked. I found it the night after the cookhouse. I came because I had to know. He nodded. He handed it back. He pulled a rag from his belt and wiped his hands with it, which she was already understanding was something he did when he was buying himself time to think. Sit down if you want, he said, and nodded at an overturned crate. Then he picked up his hammer and set it somewhere else. Not working now, just moving things, and she understood that was also time buying. She sat down on the crate. The heat of the forge was considerable even standing a few feet from it, and she understood for the first time in a concrete and physical way what it meant to work in this heat, in the Kansas summer, and she thought about the hands and the worn clothes and the single bowl of stew in a different register than she had before. Tell me, she said. He pulled another crate over and sat down across from her, forearms on his knees, and he told her. He told it plainly, without decoration. That was the only way he seemed able to do it, or possibly the only way he was willing. She hadn't yet learned enough about him to know how much of his plainness was natural and how much was armor. He'd been 12 years old, he said. Chicago, in winter. His mother had been dead for 2 years, and his father had disappeared into a bottle after her, which was a polite way of saying his father had simply gone, just not in the way that involved leaving a body. He'd been surviving on what he could take, mostly from market stalls and occasionally from the backs of delivery wagons, and he was not proud of it, and not apologizing for it either, because 12 years old and starving don't leave you many options, and he'd understood that even then. He'd gone into a bakery on a November morning because the cold had gotten inside him in a way that made him stupid, and he'd been caught by the owner before he got 3 steps out the door. The owner was a man named Edmund Crawley, who was in Chicago that week buying flour stock. He could have had me arrested, Caleb said. He had every right to. I'd taken a loaf and a wrapped portion of meat. I didn't even try to run when he caught me. I was too tired to run. What did he do? He took me back inside, sat me down, bought me a full meal. He paused. He looked at the creek through the open side of the shed. He sat across from me while I ate, which I remember because most people, when they feed someone they've caught stealing, they do it from a distance. Like charity is something they don't want to catch. He sat right across from me and talked to me like I was a person. Couldn't speak for a moment. He gave me money when I left. Enough to last through the winter, if I was careful. And he said, Caleb stopped. The pause was long enough that she wasn't sure he was going to finish. He said, don't let a hard world turn your heart to stone. That there was a cost to that, and the cost wasn't worth it. The sound of the creek came through the silence. She had known her father was a good man. She had known it the way children know their parents' best qualities incompletely, with the soft focus of love. She had not known this story. He'd never told it. He'd never told her about the boy in Chicago, or the money he'd given, or the words he'd said. He'd just kept a receipt in his lockbox for 30 years. She pressed her fingers together in her lap and worked very hard at not crying, because she did not know Caleb Rourke well enough for that, and she did not want to make this about her grief. When did you strike silver? She said when she trusted her voice. 1858, Nevada. He said it without the weight that most men put on that sentence. Men who struck silver said it like a title, like a thing that had permanently defined them. He said it like something that had happened and then mostly unhappened. I had a claim I worked for 3 years. It was a good claim, paid well, and the payment for my father's property was $1,861. I heard about the fire through a trading contact. Didn't take long to find out who Edmund Crawley was and what had happened. He picked up a small piece of iron from the ground scrap, she thought, something that had fallen from the forge, and turned it in his hands. I knew what that money would do if I didn't use it for anything. Just sit. And I knew what it could do for a family that needed it. You didn't tell him. He wouldn't have taken it if he knew where it came from. Men like your father, they don't take charity. They take fair transactions. So I made it a fair transaction. He set the scrap iron down. The property was worth it. Near enough, anyway. It wasn't worth anything close to what he'd paid. She knew that because she'd gone back to the records after finding the receipt. He'd paid nearly double the actual market value, which on the books looked like a legitimate sale, and off the books was the most elaborate form of kindness she'd ever encountered. Where did the money go? She said, after the silver. He was quiet for a moment. Families that needed it. There were a lot of them out west. He said it like it should have been obvious, Like the idea of sitting on money while people around him struggled would have been genuinely incomprehensible. And then my wife got sick. Lena, 3 years she was sick. Paid every doctor I could find, every treatment, He stopped, pressed his lips together. It wasn't enough. She died in 1869. And the bank I had my remaining savings in went under the following year in the financial panic. You lost everything. I had Evan. He said it without self-pity and without performance. Just a fact, the most important fact. And I had the forge and the tools and I knew how to work. That's not nothing. She looked around the shed. The finished ironwork against the wall. The anvil. The tools, well maintained, the handles worn smooth with use. The creek beyond the cottonwoods. The small house, functional and spare. You saved my family, she said. The money my father built back, what he left me. What I built with Harold, it all begins with that payment. He looked at her. That's not why I came to the cookhouse. I know. I didn't know who you were. When you sat down, I didn't. I know that too. He studied her face. She had the feeling he was looking for something specific, checking for pity or calculation, or the particular kind of condescension that wealthy people sometimes dressed up as warmth. She tried to let her face be just her face. Evan likes you, he said finally, which was clearly not what he'd meant to say, but there it was. He's a remarkable boy. He's a handful. Those tend to be the same thing. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, not yet, but the infrastructure of one. She filed that away. Footsteps came from behind the house. Evan appeared around the corner with mud on his boots and a toad cupped in both hands, held up with the reverence as of someone presenting treasure. Pa, look. Caleb looked at the toad, put it back. I'm going to keep it. You're going to put it back where you found it. Came to me. It was minding its own business by the creek, and you interfered with it. Evan's eyes moved to Vivian. He processed her presence considerably less surprise than his father had shown, which she found interesting. You came back, Evan said. I had a question for your father. Did he answer it? She looked at Caleb. He was looking at his son, with an expression she felt she shouldn't be watching, because it was the face of a man who loved someone so completely that he couldn't quite keep it off his face when he forgot to guard it. And it was not a face meant for company. Yes, she said. He answered it. Evan nodded, satisfied, and went back around the house, presumably to release the toad or to argue with it further. His boots left mud on the dry ground. Caleb watched him go. Then he looked at Vivian. I don't know what you want from this, he said. Not hostile, just honest. The kind of question that deserves an honest answer and is asked by someone who genuinely doesn't know the answer and is not going to pretend otherwise. She'd been thinking about that, actually, since the cookhouse, since the receipt, since the night she'd spent lying in a too-large bed, holding a piece of paper with 2 letters on it. I don't entirely know either, she said. He seemed to appreciate that more than a clean answer would have provided. The coffee here is worse than at Harlan's, he said. But Evan's been asking about making a fire and cooking something this afternoon. If you haven't got pressing business. It wasn't an invitation, exactly. It was something slightly less formal than an invitation, which was somehow harder to refuse. I haven't got pressing business, she said. He nodded. He stood up and went back to the anvil, picked up his hammer, and turned to the piece he'd been working on when she arrived. The hammering started again, steady and patient and unhurried. She sat on the crate and let the sound of it wash over her, and thought about her father, sitting across from a hungry 12-year-old boy in a Chicago bakery and paying for his meal and telling him, don't let the world turn your heart to stone. She thought her father would have found today interesting. She thought he might have smiled about it. The fire Evan made that afternoon was more smoke than heat for the first 10 minutes, and the bread he produced from somewhere in the house was 2 days old and going toward the edge of what you could call acceptable. And Caleb burned his portion of the rabbit Evan had produced from somewhere she chose not to examine the details of that too closely because he was distracted by a repair that kept not working the way. He needed it to work, and he left the fire too long. The food was bad by any reasonable standard. The tin cups they used for water were dented. Evan talked through most of the meal about Tom Sawyer and his personal theories about how the story should have ended, which were detailed and held with the absolute conviction of someone who had thought about them at length. It was nothing like any meal she'd had in the past 2 years. She drove home in the early evening with the sun going flat and orange above the brown Kansans plain. and she was most of the way back to Abilene before she realized she had not thought about the size of her house even once. That was not a small thing. She had been thinking about the size of her house, in one form or another, every day for 2 years. She tucked that realization away and drove the rest of the road in the particular silence of someone, turning something over very carefully, because they know it is fragile and worth being careful with. Behind her, the forge light was still visible through the cottonwoods, a warm, small point of orange against the dimming sky, steady as something that does not need to prove it's burning to be warm. She didn't look back, but she knew it was there. And in the morning, for the first time in she couldn't remember how long, she did not wake up thinking about the empty rooms. She woke up thinking about a burned rabbit and a boy's theories about a story's ending, and a man who had spent a fortune helping strangers and then sat into cookhouse with one bowl of stew and said, "It's a free country," when a woman asked to share his table. She lay there in the morning light and thought, there are people in the world who give everything they have without making a monument of it, without expecting recognition, without keeping score. She had met 2 of them in her life. One of them was her father. The other one's initials were CR. She came back the following Tuesday. She told herself it was because she had questions she hadn't finished asking, which was partially true. She told herself it was because she wanted to bring Evan a better copy of Tom Sawyer, the pages of his mother's copy going soft and separating at the spine, which was also true. She did not tell herself the other thing, the thing that was probably most true, because she was not yet ready to look at it directly. She brought food. Not as charity, she was careful about that, careful in a way she hadn't expected to need to be careful. She stopped at the market and bought things that could be explained as practical. Flour, salt pork, a block of hard cheese, things that didn't announce themselves as generosity. Things a person might bring to any household without making the household feel observed. Caleb looked at the parcel when she set it on the workbench. He looked at her. "I was going to the market anyway," she said. He didn't say anything. He went back to the hinge he'd been working on. She understood later that this was his version of acceptance, not thanking her, not objecting, just continuing, letting it be a normal thing because making it an event would have made it something neither of them wanted it to be. She respected that. Once she understood it, and she filed it away alongside the other things she was learning about how Caleb Rourke moved through the world. Came back the Friday after that, and the Tuesday after that. And somewhere in the 3rd week, the visits stopped feeling like visits and started feeling like something else, something without a clean name. And she stopped trying to invent reasons and just came. Evan was, she discovered, exactly as complicated as a boy who had raised himself alongside a father who was too tired and too sad to do everything and too stubborn to ask for help. He was brilliant in the sideways manner of children who've had to teach themselves. He read everything he could find, retained it completely, and had opinions about all of it that he expressed with a confidence bordering on belligerence. He could also go 3 hours without saying a single word, sitting by the creek with his feet in the water, and she never knew which version of Evan she was going to get on any given afternoon. She brought him books. He read them in days and then had notes. Actual notes, written in a composition book he kept under his bed, that he would produce without warning and read aloud from. "Problem with this one," he said one afternoon, holding up a copy of Great Expectations she'd brought from Abilene, "is that Pip spends most of it being ungrateful for things that are right in front of him." "That's rather the point," Vivian said. "It takes him too long. Most people take too long." Evan considered this. Pa doesn't. She looked at Caleb across the yard, where he was repairing a wheel, spoke for a family passing through on their way west. She didn't respond to Evan's observation because she wasn't sure what a clean response to it looked like. "He notices things right away," Evan continued, with the relentless factual precision of a child who hasn't learned yet to soften his observations. "He noticed you right away, at the cookhouse." "What do you mean?" "He watched you come in, before you came over." He said it without any particular weight, just reporting. "He doesn't usually watch people." She looked down at the page she'd been pretending to read. She said nothing. "I'm just saying," Evan said, and went back to his notes. The complications began in August. She'd known they were coming. She wasn't naive about Abilene's social arithmetic, and she had been watching the math accumulate for weeks. The way certain eyes tracked her wagon when she drove the Northeast Road, conversations that stopped a half beat. Too late when she walked into certain rooms, the invitations that stopped arriving. Abilene was a town that prided itself on its progressive character and managed this pride by policing the social borders of its most prominent residents with considerable thoroughness. A wealthy widow was acceptable as a charitable donor, a committee organizer, a tasteful presence at appropriate dinners. A wealthy widow who drove herself 4 miles out of town twice a week to sit with a poor craftsman and his motherless son was a different category of thing entirely. Dorothy Hale, whose husband ran the largest grain operation in the county, was the first to say it directly. She intercepted Vivian outside the post office on a Thursday morning in a way that had clearly been planned. "I've been meaning to speak with you," Dorothy said, in the particular tone that announced the conversation was not going to be enjoyable for at least one of its participants. "Good morning, Dorothy. I'll be direct, because we've known each other long enough for that." Dorothy's directness was a quality she took considerable pride in, and like most people who pride themselves on directness, she used it primarily for conversations she'd already won in her head before starting them. "People are talking. People generally are. About you. About the Rourke man." She said the name with a careful neutrality that was its own kind of comment. "Vivian, I understand that loneliness can make a person impulsive. Harold's been gone 2 years, and I know that's not easy. Dorothy, I'm just saying that Harold built something in this town. A reputation, a standing, and you have responsibilities to that. Harold built a lumber business," Vivian said. "He did it honestly, and he was good at it, and I respected him. But his reputation is his, not mine. And I don't believe he'd have wanted me to carry it around as a reason to avoid people I find worth knowing." Dorothy looked at her with the expression of someone who'd prepare for a different kind of resistance. "He's a blacksmith, Vivian. He has nothing. He has rather more than you'd think." "What does that mean?" "It means I know something about Caleb Rourke that you don't, and if you did, this conversation would look different to you." She picked up her parcel from the post office step. "I appreciate your concern. I genuinely do. But I'm 32 years old and I've been managing my own decisions for a while now." She walked away before Dorothy could find the next sentence, which was cowardly, and she knew it, but she was tired. And the morning was already hot and she had limited patience for conversations that required her to justify her own life. The social withdrawal happened gradually, and then all at once, the way these things do. The auxiliary committee found reasons to schedule meetings she wasn't informed about until after. Charlotte Baines, who had been a close friend of 6 years, sent a note that was so careful in its language and so obviously distressed about its own content that Vivian spent an evening feeling sorry for Charlotte before she felt sorry for herself. Dinner invitations dried up. The women who'd been reliable presences in her weekly routine began having prior engagements. She told herself it didn't touch her. She was mostly lying. She hadn't realized, until it was being removed, how much of her daily life had been organized around other people's approval. Not consciously. She hadn't thought of herself as someone who needed approval. She'd thought of herself as someone who operated independently, made her own choices, kept her own counsel. But there was a difference, she discovered, between making your own choices and making your own choices while the social architecture around you stayed intact. The first one was easy. The second one required something more than confidence. It required a willingness to feel the cold of the open air and keep going anyway. Kept going, but she felt the cold. Caleb noticed. She didn't tell him she wasn't going to make it his problem, but he was observant in the quiet, economical way of someone who'd learned to read situations quickly and act on what he read. One afternoon in mid-August, she arrived at the forge to find Evan at the creek and Caleb leaning against the shed wall waiting for her, arms crossed, which was not his usual posture. "I need to say something," he said. She stopped. "All right. I know what's happening in town, what people are saying." He looked at her steadily. "I don't need you to tell me you're fine. I can see you're fine. I'm asking if you've thought about whether this is worth the cost to you." "I've thought about it." And she considered her answer. She thought about Dorothy's face. Charlotte's careful note. The dinner invitations that didn't come. She thought about Evan's notes in his composition book and burned rabbit and a 40-year-old receipt and a father who'd sat across from a hungry boy like he was a person worth sitting across from. "Some things have a cost I'm willing to pay," she said. "And some things have a cost that would follow me the rest of my life if I paid it." He didn't say anything. "Are you trying to send me away?" she asked. "No," he said it without hesitation, which she noticed. "I'm trying to make sure you know what you're doing." Caleb, I've been managing the Mercer accounts, a house, a farm operation, and 4 separate legal disputes since Harold died. I think I can be trusted to know what I'm doing. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. The infrastructure she'd noticed before, the almost smile. I believe you, he said. I just wanted to ask. Considerate, asked and answered. He nodded. He pushed off the wall and went back inside the shed. After a moment, she followed him and sat on her usual crate and watched him work. And neither of them said anything further about it. And somehow that felt like the most important conversation they'd had yet. September came in dry and irritable, the way Kansas Septembers sometimes did. Creek dropped. The grass along the road went brown and brittle. People moved slower, talked shorter, and the accumulated exhaustion of a hard summer sat on the town like a weight that hadn't found its moment to lift. The fever appeared in the last week of August. It started, as fevers in frontier settlements always started, quietly. A child here, an elderly man there. The doctor, a competent but perpetually overwhelmed man named Aldridge, who covered the county alone, made his rounds and dispensed what he had, and recommended rest and fluids, and the other things doctors recommend when they are uncertain and their supplies are running low. By the second week of September, it was not quiet anymore. 4 children were sick, then 7, then a family out on the Miller Road, all 5 of them. And the Miller boy, the oldest, 14, died on a Thursday and was buried on Friday because you buried people fast in the heat. And the settlement held its collective breath and tried to calculate whether this was the beginning of something worse. Vivian heard about it, the way she heard about most things now, from a smaller circle than before, through the women who hadn't yet followed Dorothy Hale's social arithmetic, and through her banker, who was a practical man and not given to gossip, but who tracked anything that affected commerce and population stability. She brought it to Dr. Aldridge directly on a Monday morning, sat in his overcrowded waiting room, and asked him what he needed. He looked at her with the eyes of a man who'd been working 20-hour days for 2 weeks. More medicine, he said, specifically willow bark extract and the compound Dover's powder if anyone can source it. Ice if there's any to be had. And another doctor, but I don't see where that comes from. She wrote it down. She was good at lists. She was 3 days into sourcing when she drove out to the forge on a Wednesday and found Caleb sitting on the ground outside the house, which was wrong. He didn't sit outside in the middle of the day. He worked in the middle of the day. Sitting on the ground in the middle of the day meant something had happened. She pulled the wagon up and got down before it had fully stopped. Caleb. He looked up at her. His face had a quality she'd never seen on it before. A looseness, like the muscles had stopped doing the work they usually did. She recognized it with a cold drop in her chest. She'd seen that face on her mother when her father was sick. The face of someone who doesn't know where to put the fear. Evan, he said. She went inside. The boy was in his narrow bed in the back room, and she could feel the heat from him before she got close enough to touch him. His face was flushed and slack, and his breathing was the kind that didn't sound right too fast, too shallow, with a slight catch in it that made something animal in her go still and alert. She put her hand on his forehead. He was burning. She came back outside. How long? Since yesterday morning. Caleb's voice was careful. Too careful. The way voices get when a person is holding something very large, very still, and is afraid of what happens if they move. He said his head hurt. I thought it was the heat. By yesterday evening, he was like that. Have you sent for Aldridge? Aldridge came this morning. He doesn't have what he needs. He stopped. His jaw worked. He said, keep him cool. Keep him drinking water. He said, he stopped again. Pressed the back of his hand to his mouth briefly. He said he'd come back when he could. The sentence, he said, keep him cool, hit her differently than it might have hit her a month ago, before she'd sat with Doctor Aldridge and heard the word ice said in the particular tone of someone naming something unreachable. The creek was low. The summer had been merciless. And Evan was burning with a fever in a house with no ice, and a doctor with no medicine, and a father sitting in the dirt outside because there was nothing to do with his hands, and that was unbearable for a man who worked with his hands every waking hour of his life. She went back inside. She sat beside Evan's bed and dipped a cloth in the basin of water on the floor and laid it on his forehead and watched him breathe. She stayed for 2 hours. She helped Caleb move the basin twice, trying to get air moving through the room. She got Evan to drink 3 times. Small sips, talking to him while he drank, saying whatever came into her head, Tom Sawyer, Evan's theories about how stories should end. The toad he'd found by the creek. Nonsense. Anything until he stopped being able to answer her and went back under. She left at dusk. She drove back to Abilene with her hands tight on the reins and the flat orange sky going dark above the plain and something cold and purposeful organizing itself in her chest. In the morning, she went to the bank. It wasn't a small withdrawal. Her banker, a man named Porter, who had the useful quality of understanding when a client needed efficiency rather than conversation, looked at the figure and then looked at her and said, Is everything all right, Mrs. Mercer? Not entirely, she said, but it will be. She spent the first day sending telegrams. One to Wichita, where she had a contact at the wholesale supply operation that had done business with Harold's company. One to a physician named Marcus Webb in Topeka, who had trained in Philadelphia and had a reputation that preceded him through the letters of 3 women she knew in the capital whose families he'd treated. One to an ice house 2 counties over that she'd had cause to know about through the operation of the farm, because ice was always a logistical consideration in the Kansas summer. She was good at logistics. She had discovered that about herself in the 2 years since Harold died. She had assumed before that the management of things had been Harold's gift, and she was merely adjacent to it. She had discovered afterward that she had absorbed more than she knew and added considerably to it from somewhere of her own. The medical supply contact confirmed he had Dover's powder and willow bark compound in stock by the following morning. It would take 3 days to arrive by freight. She paid extra for a rider who could get it there in 2. Dr. Webb in Topeka took a day to respond and then required negotiation, because he was busy and Kansas was not Topeka. She offered him 3 times his usual fee and covered his travel expenses, and promised the use of the best hotel room in Abilene, and he agreed to leave on Thursday. The ice took the most effort. The ice house could deliver, but the roads between there and the Dry Creek Forge were the kind that didn't welcome heavy wagons in the heat, and she spent an afternoon coordinating the route with 2 men she paid to manage it and working out where it could be stored once it arrived. She went to the forge every day while she arranged all of this. She understood on the 3rd day that the fever was getting worse. Evan, when he was awake at all, wasn't really present. He let out a short, ugly laugh. He answered questions with the half-second delay of someone receiving information from a distance. His answers sometimes to questions she hadn't asked. His temperature hadn't dropped. And Dr. Aldridge, who came out on the 2nd day and again on the 4th, looked at the boy with the carefully neutral expression of a doctor who has learned not to put predictions on things he cannot control and cannot afford to be wrong about. Caleb worked the forge on the 1st day because there was a family who needed their wagon wheel by that evening, and he'd given his word. And because doing the work was something, he didn't work it on the 2nd day. He sat beside Evan's bed and did things with his hands, mending a leather strap, sharpening a tool blade, anything to keep his hands occupied, because the stillness of just sitting was more than he could hold. On the 3rd day, he didn't do anything with his hands. He just sat. Vivian came in that afternoon and found him sitting beside Evan, forearms on his knees, head bent. His hands were open in his lap. She had never seen his hands open and idle before. She had always seen them moving, working, producing. Open and still, they looked like something that had been set down without knowing where to set itself. She sat in the chair on the other side of Evan's bed. She dipped the cloth in the basin and laid it on the boy's forehead. She looked at Caleb. He looked back at her. He said, "I can fight most things. I know, I can fight a bad harvest. I can fight a broken contract. I can fight men like Vale." His voice was steady in a way that told her exactly how much work the steadiness was costing him. "I have never in my life been in a room with something I couldn't fight in some way, where there was nothing my hands could do." "Your hands are doing something," she said. "You're here. That's not nothing." He looked at his son. The rise and fall of the shallow breathing. "If something happens to him, don't. Vivian, don't. Because nothing is going to happen to him. Dr. Webb will be here the day after tomorrow. The medicine arrives tonight. And I am not going to sit here and let you say the thing that you're about to say because I won't accept dismiss of it." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face that she couldn't fully name. Something that was not quite gratitude and not quite surrender, and was somehow both of those things underneath a third thing she didn't have a word for yet. "You're very certain," he said. "I'm terrified," she said. "I'm also certain. Those aren't mutually exclusive." He said nothing. He looked at his son. He reached out and laid his hand on Evan's arm, lightly, the way you touch something you're afraid of disturbing but need to know is still there. The medicine arrived that evening, carried by a rider who looked like he'd pushed his horse harder than was advisable, and didn't apologize for it. Vivian paid him and tipped him, and helped Caleb measure the first dose by lamplight, reading from the paper the supply contact had included with the instructions for use. She slept that night in the chair beside Evan's bed, because driving home at midnight was impractical and because she wasn't going to leave while his breathing had that catch in it. She woke twice to give him water and once to redampen the cloth on his forehead. Caleb was in the other chair. Neither of them commented on this arrangement. Dr. Webb arrived on Thursday, which was the fourth day. He was a compact, efficient man with silver at his temples and the kind of hands that moved with the precision of someone who had learned to work quickly, because hesitation in his profession had consequences. He examined Evan thoroughly, asked questions, reviewed the medicine Vivian had sourced, added 2 additional treatments from his own bag, and reorganized the sick room with a calm, unsentimental authority that she found deeply reassuring. He told them the fever was serious. He told them the next 48 hours would determine the direction it went. He told them what to watch for, what to do at each hour, what the medicine was doing, and why. He told them this was survivable. He said it carefully, not as a promise, but as a statement of probability based on what he knew. She understood the distinction and accepted it and held on to the word survivable the way you hold on to something in a current. The ice arrived on Thursday afternoon. The logistics had worked barely, which was the way logistics usually worked. Caleb helped the men carry it in without a word, and she directed where it went. And they packed it around the edges of the room and changed it out every few hours through the evening. Caleb's neighbors arrived Thursday evening without being asked. That was the thing she hadn't expected, and it was the thing that got to her most completely. A man named Josiah from the farm to the north came with his wife, who brought a pot of something that had been cooking all day. A family from down the road, the Perkins family, sent their eldest daughter with bread and offered to sit through the night so Caleb could sleep. An old woman named Agnes, who Vivian had never met, arrived with a jar of something she claimed was good for fevers, and sat in the kitchen and refused to leave on the grounds that she had nowhere else to be. She had thought she had assumed, without examining the assumption, that Caleb existed in a kind of solitude out here, that the isolation of the forge and the 4 miles of rough road and the unspoken weight of raising a child alone meant he was apart from things, disconnected. She had been wrong about that. He was part of something. Not the social architecture of Abilene with its dinners and committees and careful alliances. Something older and less organized and considerably more reliable. She sat in the sick room through the 4th night, listening to Evan breathe, and the neighbor woman Agnes sat in the kitchen, humming something under her breath, and Caleb sat beside his son. And the ice kept the room cooler than the summer night outside. And Dr. Webb checked in every 4 hours and made notes and adjusted the treatment twice and said we wait in the matter-of-fact way of someone for whom waiting was a professional skill. Evan's fever climbed on the 4th night. She felt it when she checked him at 2 in the morning. She didn't say anything. She redampened the cloth and adjusted the dose per Webb's chart and sat back in her chair and breathed. Across the bed, Caleb's eyes were open. He was watching her. She looked at him. There was nothing useful to say. She didn't try to say it. She reached across the bed and put her hand over his. Just that. She didn't squeeze it or make anything of it. Just her hand over his open hand, the way you put something steady next to something that is trying to hold. He turned his hand over, palm up, and held on. They sat like that through the rest of the night, the lamp burning low, Agnes humming in the kitchen, the ice slowly doing its work, and the Kansas dark pressing at the windows with the particular weight of a night that doesn't know yet which way it's going to break. The light came in thin and gray through the window, the way light comes in before it's fully committed to being morning, and Vivian was awake to see it because she hadn't really slept. She drifted twice briefly in the chair beside Evan's bed. Each time she'd surfaced quickly, checking the sound of his breathing before she was fully conscious. The way you check for something you're afraid of not hearing. Each time the breathing was there. Each time she'd settled back and waited for the gray to deepen into something warmer. Caleb was still in his chair on the other side of the bed. He'd slept for perhaps 2 hours somewhere in the middle of the night sitting upright, his chin dropping, and then catching, dropping, and catching, until exhaustion won for a little while. He was awake now. He'd been awake since the lamp started to run low. Neither of them had spoken in several hours. Dr. Webb came in at 5 in the morning, moving quietly through the house with the particular care of someone used to sick rooms and the fragile quality of whatever rest could be managed inside them. He checked Evan. He took his time about it. He looked at the chart he'd been keeping on a folded paper in his coat pocket. He pressed 2 fingers to the boy's wrist and counted silently. Then he looked at Vivian. "The fever broke," he said. She heard the words. Her brain took a moment to confirm they meant what they sounded like. "When?" Caleb's voice was rough with disuse. "Sometime in the last 2 hours. His temperature is down. Still elevated, not dangerously so." Webb tucked the paper back in his pocket. "His pulse is stronger than last night. His color is better." He looked at Caleb directly, with the steady gaze of a man delivering news he needed the recipient to actually receive. "He's not out of the woods entirely. He'll need another week of the medicine, and he'll need to stay in bed." But the direction has changed. Caleb put both hands over his face. He didn't make a sound. His shoulders didn't shake. He just sat there with his face covered and his hands pressed against his eyes and breathed in a way that was doing a great deal of work that breathing doesn't usually have to do. Vivian looked at the window. She looked at the thin gray light becoming something else. She pressed her lips together and let a moment pass before she trusted herself to do anything else. Across the bed, Evan slept on, unaware of any of it, which was exactly as it should be. An hour later, the boy opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling first, then at his father, who was still in the chair, forearms on his knees now, watching him with the controlled expression of a man who has spent the entire night and most of his reserves getting to this moment and is not going to waste it. Evan's voice came out rough and small. "I'm hungry." Caleb made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else and was entirely both. He leaned forward and put his hand against the side of his son's face, the way you touch something you thought you might not get to touch again. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." Evan's eyes moved, found Vivian. He seemed to process her presence there, in the chair, in the early morning light, in a way that suggested he was still working with limited capacity, but was making the effort. "Do we have any bread?" he said. She had to look at the wall for a moment. "We'll find you some bread," she said when she had her voice back. Dr. Webb stayed through the morning. He supervised the next dose of medicine, adjusted the treatment schedule, and wrote out detailed instructions in a hand that was blessedly clear and specific. He ate breakfast at the kitchen table with Agnes. Who had slept in the seat and was apparently entirely comfortable with this and had no plans to leave until she decided she was ready. The Perkins girl had gone home at dawn, and Josiah and his wife had stayed through the night and were now also eating breakfast and talking to Webb with the frank curiosity of people who didn't often have a Topeka-trained physician at their kitchen table. Caleb was outside. Vivian went out and found him at the fence that ran along the north side of the yard, leaning on the top rail, looking at nothing in particular. She stood beside him without speaking for a while. The Kansas morning was doing the thing it did sometimes in September, the heat of summer briefly relenting, a cooler air coming in from somewhere and carrying the smell of dry grass and the creek. It would be hot again by noon. But for now the morning was almost gentle. "He's going to need things," Caleb said, "while he recovers." "Yes, I have work backed up. 4 orders I've been putting off." He said it without self-pity. "Just accounting. Trying to calculate how the days ahead were going to fit together. Can do some of it while he's sleeping. If he sleeps through the day the way Webb says he will." "Caleb." He stopped. "I'll be here," she said, "during the days while you work. I'll be with him." He looked at her. The early light was not generous to either of them. She suspected she looked like someone who'd spent 4 nights in a chair. Because she had, but he was looking at her in a way that wasn't about appearances, wasn't about any of that. "Why?" he said. It was the same question he'd asked her at the forge, that first afternoon. "Why did you come over here?" Really. She'd given him a partial answer then. She thought he deserved a more complete one now, though she wasn't sure she could give it yet. Not because she didn't know it, because knowing it and saying it out loud were different thresholds with different weights. Because there are exactly 2 people in this county whose company I find genuinely worth having, she said. One of them is 8 years old, and the other one is standing next to me. And I don't have any pressing business. He looked at the fence rail. A small muscle worked in his jaw. Evan's going to start thinking of you as he stopped. Started again. It'll get complicated. It's already complicated. More complicated. She turned to look at him. He was still looking at the fence. The scar along his jaw caught the morning light. That pale question mark shape she'd noticed the first day, and hadn't been able to stop noticing since. "Are you asking me to be careful with him?" she said. "Or are you asking me to be careful with yourself?" He was quiet for long enough that the question had fully settled between them. "Both," he said. "That's fair," she said. She went back inside to sit with Evan. Caleb went to the forge. She could hear the hammering start up after a while, that steady rhythmic sound, and she thought it was probably the best thing he could have done with the morning. Evan slept through most of the day, woke at noon to eat, asked 2 questions about Tom Sawyer that suggested his mind was working at something approaching its usual pace, and went back to sleep. Vivian read in the chair beside him and found she was not thinking about the house in Abilene, or the committees, or the women who'd stopped calling. She was thinking about schools. It had started as a vague background thought, the kind that lives in the margins of your mind without announcing itself. It had been sitting there since the first week she'd come to the forge, when she'd watched Evan read his mother's worn copy of a novel with the focused intensity of a child who understood, without anyone telling him that what was in books was worth getting to. She'd seen the composition book of notes. She'd met the children of Josiah's family, and the Perkins children, and a dozen others in the surrounding settlement who had limited access to any kind of formal education, who learned what their parents could teach them, and whatever they could get. The occasional circuit teacher who came through and stayed for a few weeks and then moved on. She had enough. She had more than enough. Harold had left her more than enough, and her own management of it had grown it beyond what she needed for one person living in a house that was too large. She had spent 2 years maintaining that wealthily and generously, donating to causes that felt appropriate, managing the farm sensibly. She had not done anything with it that she could look back at and feel had mattered in the particular way that the night she'd sourced medicine and ice and a doctor from Topeka had mattered. She was still thinking about it when she drove back to Abilene that evening. She thought about it all the way home. She thought about it through dinner, which she ate alone at the kitchen table and mostly didn't taste. She thought about it so thoroughly that by the time she went to bed, she had moved from the vague margin of the idea into something more like a plan with rough dimensions and actual numbers. She went to see her banker Porter the next morning. He listened to what she was describing. He asked several questions, which she answered. He looked at the figures she'd written out on the paper she'd brought. He was quiet for a moment. "You understand this is not a sound financial investment," he said. "It's not intended to be a financial investment. A school building, a teacher's salary, medical supplies for a clinic, basic clinic. I'm not building a hospital. I'm thinking about a room with supplies and a trained person who can be there regular days. And a small school building, 2 rooms attached." She looked at her figures. "I know what the land costs. I've already priced the lumber at 3 different suppliers." Porter looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. She had noticed over the years that men who managed money had a particular look they made when a woman turned out to understand more numbers than they'd anticipated. She'd gotten used to it, which had taken longer than it should have. "The land out that direction," he said. "Caleb Rourke owns the plot north of his forge. He told me he's been holding it. He's not using it, and it's not earning anything." "You've spoken to him about this?" "Not yet." Porter set down his pen. "Mrs. Mercer, what exactly is happening out there?" She looked at him evenly. "I'm building a school and a clinic. Because there are children in that settlement who need one, and there are families who have no access to medical care, and I have money. And those 2 things seem like they should be put in the same room together." He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded slowly, accepting this answer for what it was and what it was not. "I'll draw up the documents," he said. She went to the forge that afternoon. Evan was awake, which was progress, propped up with blankets behind him and his composition book in his lap, working on something with the focused irritability of a child who has been horizontal for 6 days and has strong opinions about this. He looked up when she came in. "Pause in the shed," he said. "He burned the porridge this morning. Are you all right?" "I'm bored." She sat down and pulled a new book from her bag, Count of Monte Cristo. She'd had to send to Wichita for it. She set it on the blanket beside him. He looked at it, then looked at her. His eyes, which were his father's eyes and always had been, went through the same assessment his father's eyes did, checking for condescension, for pity, for the particular quality of charity that came with strings. He apparently didn't find any of those things. He picked up the book. She found Caleb at the forge, doing exactly what he always did. The order for the wagon fittings was spread on his workbench, and he was halfway through it, and she watched him work for a moment before he registered she was there. "Evan's reading," she said. "He's always reading, even when he's supposed to be sleeping. I brought him something new." Caleb straightened, looked at her. He was easier to read now than he'd been in July. She wasn't sure if he'd changed or if she'd just gotten better at reading him. Probably both. "Porter is drawing up the documents," she said, "for the school and the clinic." He went very still. "I need to talk to you about the North plot," she said. She explained it. She laid it out the way she'd laid it out for Porter. The building, the 2 rooms, the land, the teacher's salary, the clinic attached. She watched him take it in. She watched him not say anything for a long time. "That's a lot of money," he said finally. "I have a lot of money. Vivian, I know what you're going to say. You don't. You're going to say it's too much, or that I'm doing this because of Evan, or that you don't want me to." I was going to say, "I'm not selling you the land." She stopped. "I'm giving it to you," he said, "for the school. You don't pay for that piece." She opened her mouth. He held up a hand. "The last thing I sold anonymously for twice its value," he said, "worked out reasonably well for everyone involved. I figure I can try giving something directly this time and see how that goes." She looked at him. He looked at her. Something in his expression was doing several things simultaneously: dry humor in the surface, and underneath that, something more careful and more open than she usually got to see. "That's not how property works," she said. "No, it's how I work." He went back to his fittings. "Talk to Porter. He can handle the paperwork. Tell him I'll sign whatever needs signing." She stood there for a moment. "You are an extraordinarily difficult person," she said. "You keep coming back anyway." She did not have a clean answer to that, and he knew it, which she suspected was precisely why he'd said it. She went back inside to sit with Evan, who was already 40 pages into Monte Cristo and had paused to write something in his composition book with an urgency that suggested the story had already generated opinions. October changed the quality of the light over the Kansas plain. The heat released its hold gradually, the way it always did, and the sky went higher and bluer, and the mornings had a clarity to them that summer never allowed. The creek came back a little with the early autumn rains. Not high, but running, and the cottonwoods went yellow at the edges. Evan recovered in the way children recover, which is to say incompletely and then all at once. He was weak for 2 weeks, and then suddenly was not. And the day Caleb found him climbing the fence rail to look at something in the north field was the day everyone tacitly agreed the crisis was over. Caleb told him to get down. Evan got down, then climbed back up the moment his father turned away, which was the most normal thing that had happened in a month. Barton Vale reappeared in October. She'd known he would. Men like Vale didn't absorb what had happened in Harlan's cookhouse and move past it. They circled it. They waited for a better moment. She'd been waiting for his moment to arrive, and she recognized it when it did, which gave her approximately 3 days more preparation than she would otherwise have had. His approach was indirect, which was new. He worked through a lawyer named Cass, who sent a letter to her banker questioning the validity of the deed on a parcel of the Mercer farm, not the North plot, a different parcel, one Harold had purchased in the final year before his death from a seller whose paperwork had been, in retrospect, not entirely clean. It was a genuine legal vulnerability. Vale had found it, which meant he'd been looking for a while. She sat in Porter's office with the letter and looked at her options. "He's not wrong about the deed," Porter said. He looked uncomfortable, which was the face he made when he had to tell her things she didn't want to hear. "The chain of title has a gap. Alderson's sale in 71, there's a previous lien that was never properly cleared. Vale could pursue this. What does he want? He hasn't stated terms. He wants me to come to him," she said. "He wants me in a conversation where he has the leverage." She looked at the letter. "How long do I have before this becomes a formal legal matter?" "If he files 30 days, perhaps 40, before it ties up the property significantly." She thought about it. She thought about the school documents, which were in the process of being finalized, the North plot, the clinic plans, everything she was building out along the Dry Creek Road, which would be considerably more complicated if Vale managed to entangle a portion of the Mercer estate in a legal dispute that dragged through the winter. She went to see Barton Vale herself. She didn't send a message first. She arrived at his office on a Tuesday morning and told his secretary she would wait however long was necessary, which turned out to be 20 minutes, because whatever Vale had expected from this situation, her appearing at his office uninvited was apparently not it, and curiosity won over strategy. His office was the kind of office that announced its own importance at every surface. Heavy furniture, a painting that was meant to convey culture, the organized clutter of a man who wanted you to see how much he was managing. She had been in rooms like this her whole adult life, and they didn't impress her. He sat behind his desk. She sat across from it. Neither of them offered pleasantries. "I assume you know why I'm here," she said. "I assume you know I have legitimate legal standing." "You have a legal argument," she said. "Whether it has standing depends on a judge, and I can afford better lawyers than you can, so let's not spend the morning on that." She folded her hands in her lap. "I want to know what you actually want, Barton, not what Cass put in the letter. What you want." He looked at her with the assessing look she remembered from the cookhouse, but it was different now. There was less pleasure in it. She'd changed something in the arithmetic of their relationship. He was still working out what exactly. "I want you to stop what you're building out on the Dry Creek Road," he said. "Cool. The clinic." She hadn't expected that specifically. "Why?" she said. "Because I have land interests in that direction, and a settlement with a school and a clinic becomes a settlement with permanence, and a settlement with permanence affects my calculations for that land." He said it with the flatness of someone being deliberately direct, which meant he was choosing transparency as a tactic. "It's not personal. It's entirely personal," she said. "But I'll grant you the business framing for efficiency." She looked at him. "You understand that if you pursue this deed dispute, I will make public the information I referenced at Harlan's cookhouse. Not the commissioner specifically, that was a specific thread, and I've since found the whole cloth." She paused. "I've had some time to look into things since July, Barton. You'd be surprised what a woman with time and money and a good memory can put together." His expression didn't collapse. He was too practiced for that. But something behind it shifted. "That's a threat," he said. "It's an accounting. You have one legal argument over a title gap. I have documentation of 3 separate arrangements that would not survive scrutiny. I'm not saying I want to use any of it. I'm saying the exchange rate doesn't favor your position." The silence in the office had a different quality than the silence at Harlan's. There, he'd been the one with the room behind him. Here they were alone, and the room didn't belong to either of them, and it was considerably more even. "The school doesn't threaten you," she said after the silence had done its work. "Really, you know that. You've been in this business long enough to know that a 2-room schoolhouse doesn't move land prices. This is about me, and about the fact that I embarrassed you in front of people, and you've been waiting for a position where I'd have to come to you." She looked at him. "I came to you. Now what?" He was quiet for a moment. "Alderson deed," he said slowly. "If the title gap were resolved, I have a lawyer who can resolve it. It will take time and money, and it's a nuisance, but it's resolvable. If it were resolved," he continued, "my legal argument disappears." "Yes, and your documentation stays where it is," she said, "unused, unless I need it." He looked at her for a long moment, with the expression of a man reassembling his position around a new set of facts. "You've gotten harder," he said, not hostile. Almost, improbably, something like respect, if Barton Vale was capable of it in the direction of someone who just outmaneuvered him. "I've always been this," she said. "You just didn't look carefully enough." She stood up. She picked up her bag. "I'll have the Alderson deed resolved within 60 days, she said. "After that, we'll have nothing further to discuss, which I think suits both of us." She left before he could find his footing again, which was the move, because moves like this only work if you make them clean. She drove back to Abilene, feeling the way she felt after difficult things that had gone, as well as difficult things can go, not triumphant, not relieved exactly, but with the particular calm of having looked at something that frightened her and found out she was bigger than it. She told Caleb about it that evening. He listened. He was at the anvil, but he'd stopped working when she started talking, the hammer resting in his hand. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You went there alone?" he said. "Who would I have brought?" He set the hammer down. "Vivian, he's not a physical threat. He's a commercial one. And commercial threats are what I know how to handle." She sat on her crate. "School documents can proceed." Porter has everything he needs. The clinic can go forward. He looked at her across the forge. The firelight moved over the planes of his face, the scar, the careful steadiness of his expression. What did you tell him? He said, to get him to back down. I told him the truth about the relative positions of his leverage and mine. Just that? I may have implied I know more about his business arrangements than is entirely the case, she said. But I do know enough that the implication wasn't dishonest. Exactly. Something crossed his face. It was the closest thing to a real smile she had gotten yet not performed, not polite, but actual. It appeared and disappeared quickly, the way things do when they're real and caught by surprise. My father would have liked you, he said. I thought you said he disappeared into a bottle. He did. Before that, he was worth knowing. The smile was gone, but the echo of it was still in his voice. He had a saying about people who knew how to stand in a room. He said most people shrink in hard rooms, and the ones who don't are the ones worth building something beside. She looked at her hands, at the crate she was sitting on, worn smooth by months of use, at the forge and the anvil and the finished ironwork along the wall, and the creek visible through the open side of the shed and the yellow cottonwoods in the October light. I've been thinking, she said, about what comes after the school and the clinic. He waited. I've been thinking about what I actually want my life to look like, she said. Not what I've been maintaining, not what Harold left me, or what my father built, or what Abilene expects. She looked up at him. What I want. He was very still. I keep coming out here, she said, and every time I drive back into town, I spend the whole road thinking about when I can come back. I sit in that house, and I don't fit in it anymore. I'm not sure I ever did. She paused. I'm saying this badly. You're saying it fine, he said. His voice had gone careful. I'm not asking you for anything, she said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not putting something on the table and expecting you to respond to it. She stopped, started again. I'm saying that the life I've been keeping has stopped being the life I actually want. And this, she made a gesture that encompassed the forge and the yard and the house behind it, where I've felt like myself. The fire in the forge burned low and steady. Outside, the October air moved through the cottonwoods. Caleb picked up a small piece of scrap iron from the workbench, turned it over in his hands the way he did when he was working something out. She watched him do it and didn't rush him. I can't give you what you have in town, he said. Can't give you dinners and status and a house. I can't give you that world. I know. And I won't pretend that doesn't matter, because you're used to things. Caleb, she said his name the way you say something when you want a person to stop and hear you. I have had that world for 2 years. I have managed it and maintained it. And I have seen it, and I have eaten alone in it, and slept alone in it, and walked through its rooms, and felt like a caretaker of something that belongs to someone else. She looked at him. I don't want to be rescued. I don't want to be pitied. I'm not here because you need me. She paused. I'm here because I do. He set the scrap iron down. He looked at her for a long time, in the particular way he had of looking at things, the way iron looks in a fire absorbing, taking the measure of something, finding out whether it's ready. There's something I need to say, he said. All right. I have a son who has already lost one person. He said it plainly, without theater. I will not let him lose another one, because I made a choice that felt right and turned out not to be. So whatever this is, he looked at her, has to be something I can put my hand on and know it's solid. Not something that sounds good right now and changes later. That's fair, she said. That's completely fair. I'm not fast with this, he said. I never have been. I worked Lena's father for 2 years before he took me seriously. I'm not in a hurry. You might get tired of waiting. I drove out here twice a week for 4 months, because I wanted to, she said. I sat in that chair for 4 nights because I needed to be there. I am not someone who gets tired and leaves. He looked at her. The October evening light was coming through the open side of the shed now, going warm and flat the way it did at the end of the day. There's only one bowl most nights, he said. I want to be plain about that. She thought about the first day, the cookhouse. The bowl pushed across the table. A man giving his son the only thing he had, without looking like he was giving anything at all. I know, she said. I came over and asked for a seat anyway. The forge fire popped once and settled. From inside the house came the sound of Evan's voice, reading aloud to himself from Monte Cristo, the words indistinct through the wall, but the rhythm of them clear. That particular cadence of a child reading something that has caught him completely. Caleb listened to it. She watched him listen to it. He turned back to his work, but something in the set of his shoulders had changed. Some held thing had released, not dramatically, not cleanly, but in the way things release in real life imperfectly, gradually, like a door that's been stuck finally finding its frame. She sat on her crate. She did not go home that evening until the stars were out, and Evan had fallen asleep mid-chapter and the forge had gone dark and cold. And Caleb had walked her to her wagon without ceremony and stood in the yard while she drove away, a dark shape against the dark yard, still and quiet as the iron he worked. She drove home through the October night, and for the first time she could remember clearly, the house she was driving toward felt like a place she was leaving rather than a place she was returning to. Alderson deed took 43 days to resolve. Vivian's lawyer, a methodical man from Wichita named Gerald Pruitt, who had the useful quality of being entirely unimpressed by other lawyers, tracked the original lien through 3 counties and 2 deceased signatories, and found the release document that had been filed incorrectly in 1869 in a county clerk's office that had since reorganized its records twice. He produced it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had known it was there and simply needed to find it, and the title gap closed, and Barton Vale's legal argument evaporated without ceremony. Vale said nothing about it. He did not acknowledge the outcome. He simply moved on to other calculations, the way men like him always did, because attachment to any single loss was a luxury they couldn't afford. She watched him recede from her immediate concerns, the way a weather system moves off, still visible on the horizon, worth keeping an eye on, but no longer the thing directly overhead. School broke ground in November. Porter had the documents finalized in the 3rd week of October, and Caleb had signed the deed transfer for the North Plot with the same plain efficiency. He brought to everything no ceremony, no commentary, just a signature and a nod and a return to the hinge he'd been working on. The lumber came from a supplier in Salina that Vivian had negotiated with directly, which had surprised the supplier and not surprised Porter, who had stopped being surprised by her by then. The building went up faster than she'd expected, partly because 3 families from the settlement showed up the first Saturday with tools and labor and no prior arrangement, just the news that something was being built that their children might use. Josiah was there. The Perkins family sent 2 sons. A man named Crawford, who she'd never met, appeared with a level and a knowledge of framing that turned out to be exactly what was needed when the north wall went slightly out of square on the 2nd day. Caleb worked beside them. He didn't organize or direct, that wasn't how he operated, but he was there from the first morning, and his work was what it always was: precise, efficient, without waste. She watched him alongside these men and saw something she hadn't seen before, or hadn't known how to name before. He was not separate from this community. He was embedded in it in the quiet, functional way of someone who had been giving to it steadily for years, without making that giving visible. He'd repaired Josiah's plow in the spring without charging him, because Josiah had lost cattle, and the math didn't work. He'd fixed the Perkins family's roof brackets after the summer hail, and taken payment in kind preserved food, which he needed more than money. He knew these people in the way that comes from proximity and necessity, and the particular solidarity of people who understand that they are each other's only margin. She understood something watching him work. The kindness that had once moved his entire fortune around without announcement had not stopped when the fortune ran out. It had just scaled down to what he had, which was his time and his skill and his presence. She stood in the frame of the unfinished school building on a Saturday afternoon in November, looking at the settling sun over the Kansas plain, and thought about what it meant to be generous without resources. She had resources. She had always had them, or had them restored to her when they were briefly lost. She had never known what it cost to be generous, from nothing, from the bottom of what you had, from one bowl of stew. She thought she was beginning to understand it. Evan recovered completely by mid-October, witch doctor. Webb confirmed on a follow-up visit that Vivian had paid for and arranged without informing Caleb until the morning Webb arrived, at which point it was too late to object. Caleb had objected anyway, on principle, and she had pointed out that the alternative was him, driving Evan to Abilene on the rough road in a borrowed wagon, and he had eventually acknowledged this was a reasonable point while not quite saying so directly. Webb examined Evan, declared him entirely well, gave him a stern lecture about not overtaxing himself through the winter, that Evan listened to, with the polite expression of someone who had no intention of following it, and then spent an unexpected 40 minutes in the kitchen talking to Agnes, who had become a semi-permanent fixture in the Rourke household in a way that no one had explicitly invited, but everyone had implicitly accepted. "He says I have a good diagnostic instinct," Agnes reported afterward, with considerable satisfaction. "You told him the boy was going to be fine before any of us knew that," Caleb said. "I've been watching children be sick for 50 years, Agnes said. "You learn things." "She was right," Vivian said. "Of course, I was right," Agnes said, and went back to whatever she'd been doing in the kitchen, which always seemed to involve something that smelled considerably better than what Caleb would have produced independently. Agnes was 64 and had been a widow for 11 years and had 5 adult children spread across 3 states who sent letters with some regularity and visited with less. She had arrived during the fever crisis, and the crisis had passed, and she had assessed the situation with the pragmatic thoroughness of someone who had been running households since she was 19 and recognized one that needed running. She came 3 days a week. She cooked. She gave Evan opinions about his reading that he argued with and largely incorporated. She talked to Caleb with the directness of someone who had decided he was sensible enough to handle directness and found she was mostly right. She told Vivian one afternoon when they were the only ones there that she was glad someone had finally turned up with some sense. "I've been watching that man live like a monk for 5 years, Agnes said, without looking up from the bread she was working. "Good man, terrible at being a person. He's very capable. At iron, at the forge, at keeping himself and the boy fed and clothed." Agnes pressed the heels of her hands into the dough with efficient force. Not at anything else. Not at letting people in. Not at asking for help. He'd have let that boy get sicker before he'd have sent for a doctor 2 counties over and spent money he didn't have. She looked up. "You spent it for him. He let you. That's something, for Caleb Rourke." Vivian thought about the hand in the dark on the 4th night of the fever. Palm turned up, the holding on. "Yes," she said. "Think it is." Agnes looked at her with the assessing look of someone who has seen a great deal of human behavior and has catalogued it thoroughly. "He's not easy," she said. "I know. He'll argue with you. He'll decide things without telling you and then be surprised when you have an opinion about it. I've noticed. He thinks caring about people means protecting them from things instead of telling them the truth." Agnes returned to the bread. Lena used to get frustrated with that. She was a direct woman. She sounds like she was. She was. Good woman. Wrong lungs for Kansas. Agnes said it plainly without sentimentality. Grief that had been sitting for 5 years had a different texture than new grief. And Agnes had known Lena Rourke, and the plainness was its own form of respect. She would have liked you. She had a low tolerance for people who weren't real. Vivian wasn't sure what to say to that. She said nothing, which seemed right. "He does too," Agnes said. "Like you. Low tolerance for people who aren't real." She shaped the loaf with practiced hands. "That boy with 1 bowl of stew at the cookhouse, that's him being real. That's the most him there is. Giving the last thing he has without looking like he's giving anything." She put the loaf in the pan. "Somebody who sees that clearly enough to walk across the room, that's also real." Vivian drove home that evening, thinking about what it meant to be seen. Not performed at, not maintained for, not evaluated. Seen. She had been visible her whole adult life. Visible as Harold's wife, as the Mercer widow, as the wealthy woman on the committee, as the name at the bottom of the charitable donations. She had not often been seen. The proposal, if it could be called that, because it was considerably less formal than the word suggested, and considerably more earned, happened in December, which was not when she'd expected it and not how she'd imagined it, because the things that matter almost never happen how you imagine them. The school was finished. They'd had a small opening, just the families from the settlement, and Dr. Aldridge and Agnes and Pruitt the lawyer, who'd driven out from Wichita because he'd taken an interest in the project. Teacher Vivian had hired was a woman named Ruth Calloway, 26, from Ohio, who had answered the advertisement in the Wichita paper with a letter that was so direct and specific about her qualifications and her expectations for the Vivian had hired her on the letter alone. Ruth had arrived in November, slightly alarmed by Kansas in general, and reassured by Agnes specifically, and had spent her first 3 weeks organizing the schoolroom with the thoroughness of someone who understands that a well-organized room teaches children something before they've opened a single book. Evan was her first student, technically, since he'd been helping her sort, and shelve the books that Vivian had ordered from 3 different suppliers, and which had arrived in a quantity that slightly exceeded what Ruth had been told to expect. "I thought you said 50 books," Ruth said, looking at the crates. "I said approximately 50, Vivian said. "There are 112. I may have had a generous definition of approximately." Ruth had looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating. Then she'd looked at Evan, who was already opening one of the crates. Then she'd started unpacking. The clinic occupied the attached room, smaller, with a cot and a locked cabinet for supplies and a schedule on the wall that showed which days a traveling physician would be available and which days the nurse Vivian had arranged a capable woman named Harriet from Abilene who had trained under a hospital in St. Louis and was underused in town would be present. It was not a hospital. It was a room with the right things in it and people who knew how to use them, and that was more than the settlement had ever had. Dr. Aldridge came out to look at it and stood in the room for a long moment. "I've been covering this county alone for 9 years, he said. "I know," Vivian said. This would he stopped. Started again, the Miller boy, in September. If Harriet had been 20 minutes closer. "I know," she said again more quietly. He nodded. He did not say thank you, which she appreciated, because thank you would have made it about her, and it wasn't about her. He just nodded and looked at the cabinet of supplies and the cot with its clean cover and the schedule, and something in his face and something settled into a kind of relief that had been a long time coming. December arrived with the first real cold, and the Kansas winter announced itself the way it always did, not gradually, but as a statement, temperatures dropping and the sky going the flat white of coming weather. The forge ran longer hours because cold made iron behave differently, and because people needed things fixed before winter locked the roads. She was there on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting in the house with Evan while Caleb worked, helping Evan with an arithmetic problem that had defeated him, and that he was approaching with the frustrated determination of someone who considered failure a personal affront. Agnes had come and gone that morning. The house smelled of the stew she'd left on the stove, which was better than anything Caleb would have produced, and both of them knew it. "If a man travels 14 miles at 4 miles per hour, Evan said, with the tone of someone laying out the terms of a grievance, why does it matter how long it takes him? Because the time affects other decisions. If it takes him 3.5 hours, does he have light to travel by? Does he arrive before the market closes?" Evan looked at the problem, looked at her. "That's not in the problem. It's why the problem exists." He chewed on this. "Miss Calloway doesn't explain it that way. Miss Calloway has a different teaching style. She says because mathematics requires it, and then looks at me until I do it. That's also a valid approach." He wrote down the calculation with the resigned energy of someone humoring an unreasonable universe, and got it right, and then looked at it like he wasn't entirely sure he'd done himself a favor by succeeding. Caleb came in from the forge at dusk. He poured water from the bucket and washed his hands and face, and the cold had reddened the back of his neck, and the scar along his jaw was sharper in the winter light. He looked at the problem in Evan's book. "Did you get it?" he said. "With interference," Evan said. "Without interference, he would have gotten it wrong and been angry about it for 2 days, Vivian said. "I would not have been angry for 2 days. You were angry for 3 days. About the geography problem last month." Evan opened his mouth, and then, apparently, could not find a useful counter-argument and closed it again. Caleb almost smiled. Vivian watched the infrastructure of it, the familiar, almost landscape of his face, moving towards something it still mostly kept back, and she looked down at the table before she was caught watching, too, obviously. After Evan went to bed, she stayed to help put the kitchen in order, which was not strictly necessary, but had become a habit. She washed the bowls. He dried them. They had been doing this for weeks, and it had the quality that repeated small domestic acts develop when they've been done often enough, not romantic, not charged, just the particular ease of 2 people who know where things go and move around each other without explaining. He set the last bowl in its place on the shelf. "The Hawkins family," he said. She looked at him. "Down on the Miller Road. They're going to lose the farm." He turned the cup in his hands once before setting it down. "Hawkins came by this morning. Banks calling the note." He's 3 months behind, and he doesn't have what he needs to catch up. He looked at the shelf. He wasn't asking me for anything. He was just saying it. The way people say things to me because they don't know who else to say them to. She thought about the Miller Road. The Hawkins family had 3 children. The oldest, a girl of about 12, had started attending Ruth's school 2 weeks ago and had arrived each morning with the concentrated expression of someone who understood that what was being offered was not ordinary and could not be taken for granted. "How much?" Vivian said. He told her the number. It was not a large number in the context of what she had. It was an enormous number in the context of what the Hawkins family had. She dried her hands on the cloth. She thought about a 40-year-old receipt in a lockbox. Payment for a failing property at twice its worth. An anonymous transaction that had looked like a fair sale and was actually an act of such deliberate, quiet generosity that it had rearranged the trajectory of an entire family across 2 generations. "I'll have Porter arrange it," she said, "through an intermediary. He'll receive a payment on the note from an unnamed buyer, resolved in full. He won't know where it came from." Caleb was looking at her. "Anonymous," she said, "like a fair transaction." Something moved through his face. She watched it come and go recognition, and something older than recognition, something that reached back to a receipt and a bakery in Chicago, and a man who sat across from a hungry boy like he was a person worth sitting across from. "My father would have done the same," he said. "I know," she said. "That's where I learned it." He stood very still. "Not from your father specifically," she said. "From watching what you did with his lesson. From understanding that generosity isn't about what you have. It's about what you see." She folded the cloth. "You saw a man who needed saving, and you saved him without letting him know he was being saved. I watched you give Evan your stew. I watched you sign away that land. I watched you fix Josiah's plow and the Perkins roof and show up at the school build. And I have money, Caleb. I have the money that your generosity made possible. It seems right that it keeps moving." He was quiet for a long moment. "You're the most unexpected person I've ever met," he said. "You've been saying things like that without actually saying them for months," she said. "I'm not sure what you're waiting for." He looked at her across the kitchen. The lamp was low. Outside, the December wind was moving through the cottonwoods, and somewhere in the house Evan was asleep, with a book probably open across his chest, because that was how he always fell asleep regardless of what anyone said about it. "I've been waiting to be sure," Caleb said. "And?" He picked up the lamp and moved it to the table and sat down, which was what he did when he was going to say something he'd been preparing for a while. She sat across from him, and the lamplight was between them, and she waited. "I told you I wasn't fast with this," he said. "You did. I told you Evan couldn't lose another person. I remember. I've been watching you for 5 months, not looking for problems. Watching." He turned his hands over on the table, palm up, the same gesture she'd seen in the sick room. The same open offering of something usually kept closed. "You drove out here twice a week in the Kansas summer. You sat in a chair for 4 nights. You threatened Vail and built a school and arranged a doctor from Topeka and negotiated lumber prices. And you did all of it without once making it about yourself." He paused. "And the thing I keep coming back to is the first day. The cookhouse. You didn't come over because you felt sorry for us. No. Why did you come over?" She'd given him the partial answer. She'd given him the practical answer. She gave him the real one now. "Because I watched you give away the only thing you had without looking like you were giving anything," she said. "And I thought, that's what I want to understand. That's what I want to know how to be." He looked at her for a long time. "Come here," he said. She looked at him. "I'm asking you properly," he said. "Come over here and let me ask you something properly." She stood up and walked around the table, and he stood up. And he was taller than she generally thought of him as being, because most of the time they were both sitting or he was at the forge, and she was watching from a crate and scalost in the habits of a space. He was looking at her without the careful steadiness he usually kept, without the managed expression, without the door mostly closed. He was just his actual face. "I don't have a ring," he said. "I had Lena's, and I gave it to Evan to keep because it was his mother's. I'll get you a ring, but I don't have one right now. Caleb, I'm not going to have more money than I have. The forge makes what it makes, and there are good weeks, and there are weeks like the first time you saw me." He held her gaze. "I can't give you a house like the one in town. I can build onto this one. I'm good at building, but it'll be this, out here by the creek. 4 miles of rough road. Agnes 3 days a week. Evan with his opinions about everything. Yes, she said. I haven't asked yet. You've been asking for 5 months, she said. Every time you walked me to the wagon. Every time you didn't send me away when you could have. Every time you let me sit on that crate and watch you work. She looked at him. I've been saying yes for 5 months. I'm just saying it out loud now. He put his hand against the side of her face, the way she'd watched him touch Evan in the sick room, like something he'd thought he might not get to touch. Stay, he said. It was not a large word. It was the largest word he had. Yes, she said. They were married in April, under the oak tree beside the creek, when the cottonwoods were coming in green, and the Kansas spring was doing its brief, effortful thing before the summer remembered to arrive. The ceremony was small because they wanted it small. Agnes was there, Josiah and his wife, the Perkins family, Ruth Calloway from the school, Dr. Aldridge, Pruitt the lawyer, who had driven out again from Wichita and who Vivian suspected had developed a fondness for the settlement that had nothing to do with legal business. Porter came. She hadn't expected that, but he arrived in his good coat and stood at the back and afterwards shook Caleb's hand with the firm grip of a man giving something his genuine endorsement. Evan stood beside his father throughout. Evan stood beside his father too large because Caleb had bought it with the understanding that boys grow, and it was better to buy for what he'd be than what he was. He held the rings. Caleb had gotten one made, a simple iron band with a single piece of polished brass inset made by his own hand, which was the most Caleb thing she could have imagined, and he held them with the ceremonial gravity of someone who understood the weight of the occasion and was choosing to honor it. Afterwards, when the food was eaten and the afternoon was going long, Evan appeared at Vivian's side. She looked down at him. He held out his hand. In his palm was a small carved wooden horse, worn smooth with handling. She'd seen it before on his windowsill. This was my mother's, he said. Before it was mine. He held it out further. I want it to be yours now, since you're staying. She looked at the small horse. She looked at the boy's face, which was entirely serious, which was the face he used when he meant something completely. She took it very carefully. Thank you, she said. You can keep it on your windowsill, he said. That's where I keep things I want to remember. He assessed her for a moment. You should know I will still have opinions about books. I would be concerned if you didn't, and about porridge. Your father burns it. Every time, Evan said, with the exhausted authority of someone who has been living with this problem for years. Then he went back to the creek, where he had been observing something in the shallows. With the focused attention he brought to anything that held still long enough to be examined. Vivian held the small wooden horse and watched the creek and felt something small wooden horse and watched something she hadn't felt in a very long time, a thing she hadn't known she was missing because she hadn't known it was possible to miss something you'd never quite had. She felt located, not in the geographic sense, though she knew exactly where she was, 4 miles northeast of Abilene, beside Dry Creek, under an oak tree in April. She felt located in the deeper sense, the sense of being exactly where she was supposed to be, not because someone had arranged it or because she'd planned for it, but because she'd walked toward the things that were real and kept walking until she arrived somewhere that held. Caleb came to stand beside her. He looked at the horse in her hand. He looked at Evan at the creek. He thought about that. For 2 weeks, Caleb said. Did he ask you? He told me. There's a difference. He doesn't ask. He decides and then informs. He looked at the creek. He's right, though. That's what she would have done. She leaned her shoulder against his arm. He let it rest there. They stood like that while the April afternoon went on around them, Agnes directing the cleanup of the food table with the efficiency of someone who considers post-event organization a moral position, Ruth talking to Josiah's wife about the school's next quarter doctor. Aldridge examining something in his coat pocket with the distracted air of someone whose mind was already on the next patient. The life that was assembling itself around her was not the life she had planned. It was louder and more complicated and considerably less comfortable in the physical sense. The house was small. The road was rough. The forge started at first light, and the sound of it was part of every morning now, that rhythmic hammering that she had stopped hearing as external noise and started hearing as something more like a heartbeat. Agnes's opinions filled the kitchen 3 days a week. Evan's composition book had expanded to 3 volumes and showed no signs of stopping. There was almost always something that needed fixing, or negotiating, or sourcing, and the resources she'd committed to the school and the clinic meant her financial position required more careful management than before. which she found she didn't mind, because careful management of things that mattered was not the same as managing things that didn't. She had sold the house in Abilene in February. She'd made the decision, told Porter, and spent one final afternoon walking through the rooms to confirm she was sure. She was sure. The rooms that had been too large for one person were just rooms. She took her father's lockbox, which she'd brought from her father's house to Harold's house, to this house across 30 years. She left everything else to be inventoried for the sale. She drove away on a February morning with the lockbox on the seat beside her and did not look back at the house, because the things worth keeping had already been moved. The receipt was still in the lockbox. She hadn't moved it. She thought she might always keep it there, the way you keep something that marks a point of, before and after, a record of the exact moment the current changed direction. In the months after the wedding, the anonymous payments began. The first one was the Hawkins farm note, which had been resolved before the wedding, and which Tom Hawkins had spent considerable energy trying to trace without success, because Porter had been instructed to be thorough about the anonymity, and Porter was thorough about everything. Hawkins had eventually stopped trying to find the source and had instead put the saved farm to work with particular focused energy of a man who understood he'd been given something and intended to justify it. His daughter Clara was Ruth's best student. She had a mind for mathematics that Evan acknowledged with the respect he reserved for things he couldn't immediately surpass, which was not many things. The second payment was for the elderly Greer couple on the North Road, whose roof had collapsed in a winter storm and who had no resources to replace it and no family within 2 states. An anonymous payment covered the lumber and the labor, delivered through an intermediary with no explanation. Their neighbor Josiah organized the building crew. The roof went up in 3 days. There were others, quiet ones, arranged through Porter, who had stopped asking questions about the sources and was, she suspected, occasionally contributing from his own resources, without telling her, because he was that kind of person underneath the professional exterior and people sometimes surprised you. Caleb knew. She hadn't hidden it from him, and he wouldn't have wanted her to. He didn't participate in the arrangements that was her domain, and he understood the difference between his strengths and hers, but he was often the one who knew. He heard things at the forge in the particular way that people told things to the man who fixed their wagons and their tools, and their roof brackets, the man who existed at the useful intersection of trust and need. He would mention what he heard, plainly, without suggesting what should be done, and she would think about it. And sometimes something would happen, and sometimes it wouldn't, depending on what was possible. It was not a system. It was just 2 people paying attention. Barton Vale left Abilene in the summer of 1876. He'd overextended on a land speculation that collapsed when the railroad route he'd been counting on was rerouted 40 miles south, and the subsequent financial difficulty had made certain other aspects of his business arrangements harder to keep quiet. He went to Denver, where there were presumably new calculations to make. Cookhouse changed owners. The office, where she'd outmaneuvered him, became a dry goods store. She did not spend much time thinking about Barton Vale. She had not spent much time thinking about him, even when he was the most pressing concern. He was the kind of man who believed himself to be the main thing in any room, and the most effective response to that belief was to simply not organize your life around it. Evan started teaching at Ruth's school when he was 17, which surprised everyone, except Vivian, who had watched him correct other students' reasoning since he was 9, and had been waiting for him to formalize the impulse. He had his mother's patience, which Caleb said he hadn't, and his father's precision, which Vivian said was the most useful inheritance she could think of, and his own particular quality, a directness in the classroom that students found disconcerting at first, and then couldn't imagine being without. He kept his composition books. By the time he was 20, he had 11 of them, filled with notes on every book he'd read, organized by a system only he fully understood, cross-referenced in margins, with a handwriting that had become its own distinct thing. Neither Caleb's plain, functional script nor the formal cursive the school had tried to impose on him. He kept the little wooden horse on his desk. He told his students, when they asked, that it had belonged to his mother, and then to him, and then to the woman who had come and stayed, and that the thing to understand about it was not what it was made of, but what it had survived. It had survived a death and a poverty and a fever, and 5 years of a house that was too quiet. It had survived being loved by 3 different people in 3 different ways. Things that get loved like that, he told them, don't break easy. The years pass the way years pass when you are living in them, rather than waiting for them to end, not quickly, not slowly, but with the particular fullness of time that is actually being used. The school expanded. Ruth stayed, which Vivian had hoped for and not assumed, because capable people had options, and options meant they could leave. Ruth stayed because she had found, in the 2-room school beside the creek in Kansas, something she hadn't found anywhere else, which was the feeling that the work she was doing was the work she was supposed to be doing, which is rarer than people think and worth staying for when you find it. Clinic grew slowly, adding a second nurse and expanding its schedule as the settlement grew. Dr. Aldridge began training a young man from the settlement in basic medical practice, the first step in something that would eventually become its own institution, though Aldridge didn't live to see all of it. He died in 1881, his desk, with his coat on and his bag packed for the morning rounds, which was exactly how he would have chosen to go. And the settlement mourned him with the particular grief of people losing someone who had been useful to them in the deepest sense of the word. The forge kept going. Caleb's work changed as he got older, less of the heavy repair work, more of the precision craftsmanship, the decorative ironwork that people began to commission when they understood what he could do. He was never wealthy. He was also never again down to one bowl. The equilibrium they found was not abundance, in the way Vivian had once known abundance. It was a different thing, a steadier thing, the kind that doesn't depend on prices staying favorable or banks staying solvent. She sat with him on the wide porch they'd built along the south side of the house in 1878, in the evenings when the forge was dark and the school was quiet, and Evan had gone home to the small house he'd built himself on the far edge of the property with the focused competence of someone who had grown up watching things get built. The Kansas sky did what it did in the evenings, went wide and unreasonable colors that didn't seem like they should be possible over a flat plain kind of sky that made you understand why people who lived here stayed, even through everything it put them through. She was 51 years old on the evening she was thinking about. It was September, and the creek was low again, the way it always was in September, and the cottonwoods had gone yellow at the edges, the way they always did. Caleb's hair had gone gray at the temples, which had happened gradually over several years, and then seemed to have happened all at once. Scar along his jaw was the same as always. His hands were the same, marked and certain and still, when they were still, with that particular open quality she had seen on the 4th night of the fever, and had never stopped seeing when she looked for it. She was holding the small wooden horse. She did this sometimes in the evenings, the way you handle things that mark something important. She'd had it 20 years, and the wood was smoother than when Evan had placed it in her hand at the wedding. Smooth from being held, from being turned over, from the accumulated contact of years. She thought about the cookhouse. She thought about the bowl pushed across the table, and the boy watching his father's face, and the receipt in the lockbox, and the 4 miles of rough road in the Kansas summer, and a voice asking, "Can I sit with you?" across a room where no one knew anyone's last name. She thought about her father, sitting across from a frightened boy in a Chicago bakery, and telling him, "Don't let the world turn your heart to stone." She had thought about that a great deal over 20 years, about what it meant to protect yourself by hardening. She had done some of that hardening after Harold died. Before she understood, it was happening in the house that was too large, the committees, the carefully maintained distances, the wealth that insulated you from need, and also, quietly, from the kind of contact that need creates. She had been turning to stone in a house full of rooms, and she hadn't known it until she walked across a cookhouse and sat down across from 2 people who had nothing and were entirely real. That was the thing she thought about when she thought about what the years had given her. Not the school, not the clinic, not the anonymous payments or the legal victories or the social recovery that had happened slowly after Abilene understood that Vivian Mercer Rourke was not going to be embarrassed by her choices and was in fact going to keep making them. Those were the things that had happened. They were not the thing. The thing was simpler than any of it. She had found people who were real, and she had been real back, and they had built a life out of that basic exchange. It was a life with burned porridge in it and rough roads and composition books, full of opinions and Agnes's directness and the sound of the forge from first light, and a boy who became a man who kept a wooden horse on his desk because things that have been loved by 3 people don't break easy. It was a life that had room in it. Room for people who were struggling, room for children who needed books, room for neighbors who needed roofs, room for a Topeka doctor and a nurse from St. Louis and a lawyer who drove from Wichita more often than business required. An open door and a fire always burning, which was not a metaphor, but a fact. Caleb kept the fire in the forge, and Vivian kept the lamp in the window, and both of them, independently and together, had a low tolerance for closed doors. "You're thinking about something," Caleb said. She looked at him. He was looking at the creek. "The cookhouse," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "July," he said. "July." "You sat down like you owned the place." "I sat down like I was tired of standing outside it," she said. He made the va sound she still found difficult to describe, not quite a laugh. Something easier than that. The thing his voice did, when he was comfortable enough not to guard it. 20 years, and it still arrived with the same small force as the first time. She set the wooden horse on the arm of her chair. She looked at the Kansas evening going wide and impossible above the plain. She thought about what she would say. If she could say something to the woman who'd walked out of the Abilene Bank on a July morning in 1874 and gone to a cookhouse for lunch and sat down at the wrong table, or the right one, and changed the direction of everything without knowing that was what she was doing. She thought she would say, "The thing you're looking for is not in the rooms that are too large or the committees or the maintenance of what someone else built. The thing you're looking for is in the movement toward what's real. Even when it's 4 miles of rough road, even when the cost is visible and social and paid in other people's opinions, even when the bowl is the only bowl," she thought she would say, "the kindness your father showed to a boy in a bakery came back to you. Not because the universe is arranged fairly, it isn't, but because that boy carried it. He carried it across a continent and 20 years and a fortune made and spent and lost, and he carried it a cookhouse on a July morning and pushed it across the table to his son without looking like he was pushing anything at all." She thought she would say, "Go sit down. Stop waiting for an invitation. Go sit down and find out who is real." "The coffee at Harlan's really was terrible," she said. Caleb looked at her. The almost smile, which had long since stopped being an almost, and was just itself now, easy and unguarded in the way things become easy when they've been practiced for 20 years. Evan still says the place on 2nd Street was better. He was 8. He had good instincts. He had instincts about pie. "Same thing," Caleb said. She picked up the wooden horse. She held it in her palm. She thought about 3 people who had loved it, and the things it had survived, and the desk in the schoolroom where it sat on the mornings she was not holding it, looking out at children who were learning that the world had more in it than their circumstances suggested. She thought about her father's voice, a voice she could no longer quite hear clearly, but whose shape she remembered. "Don't let a hard world turn your heart to stone." He had said it to a boy who had nothing. The boy had taken it and built something with it that money couldn't account for. That something had come back around, the way things do when they are genuinely released rather than held on to, not because the world is fair, but because generosity has a weight to it that moves, that carries, that lands somewhere and changes the terms of what's possible. Creek moved in its low September bed. The cottonwoods were going yellow. The forge was dark, and the school was quiet, and somewhere in the small house, at the far edge of the property, a lamp was on at a desk where a man with his father's eyes was making notes in the margins of a book about the way the world worked and how it ought to. Vivian Mercer Rourke sat on the porch of the house she had chosen and held a small wooden horse in her hand and understood, not for the first time, but perhaps most clearly of all, that she had never really been asking for a chair. She had been asking for a home, and she had found it not in the house in Abilene, not in Harold's, not in the life that had been arranged for her to maintain. She had found it in the movement toward what was real, in walking across a room, in sitting down without being invited and finding out that the person across the table had no use for pretense and all the use in the world for someone who didn't either. That was the whole of it. That was what 20 years, and a fever, and a school, and a clinic, and a forge, and a boy with opinions about stories had taught her. You find your people not by waiting in the right rooms, but by being willing to enter the wrong ones. You build your home not from what you're given, but from what you're willing to give. And love the kind worth choosing, the kind worth crossing a room for, the kind that stays through the fever and the rough road and the burned porridge and the empty bowls. That kind does not arrive. It is built, slowly, from the things that are real. Caleb took her hand. The Kansas evening went on above them, wide and unreasonable and entirely itself. And the fire in the forge was dark, but it would be lit again in the morning. And the lamp in the window was burning, and the door was open, the way it always was, for whoever needed to come in.